This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. I am sorry that the show is a little bit late this week. I got really distracted by voting and by being in the Sierras. If you are an American and you have not voted yet and you have the opportunity to do so, I strongly suggest you get yourself to the polls or mail in that ballot as soon as possible. Turning away from that to the actual meat of the show, I am super excited about the show this week because I had Dr. Barbara King on the show, who was actually a professor of mine when I was an undergraduate. And it's a really interesting kind of different show because Dr. King is kind of a different type of anthropologist than we've had on before. We talk a lot about different transitions in her career. So she started out as a very traditional biological anthropologist, very interested in primate behavior, studying baboons, and over time her interest shifted into understanding more about animal cognition and sentience more broadly, which is one of the shifts that we talk about. And then later in her career, she transitioned into being more of an advocate for animals. And all of this is interrelated in a super interesting way. The really nice thing about Dr. King is that she is a super coherent and intelligent speaker. And so she kind of delivers these really tight, interesting sentences that have all of the information just wrapped up in a neat little bow. I honestly really enjoyed editing this episode. I think I only took out a single from her track the entire time, and I am so grateful that y'all can't hear the unedited versions of this because it takes a lot to make me sound smart. Anyway, I really, really loved having Dr. King on. I hope that y'all enjoy the show too. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. Or you can find me on Instagram, Twitter. Very bad at Twitter, but I try. And also, please, if you like the show, share an episode with someone who you think will like it too. One last note. During this intro, you've probably heard chirping in the background. That is because I'm up in the mountains. During the actual show, you will probably also hear some background noises that I just couldn't take out. Some ambulances went by on my side. It sounded like there might have been some birds or cats on Dr. King's side. Apologies for that. I'm just not a master of editing, so I don't know how to take that out. I think you'll still enjoy the show, though. So without further ado, here you go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. You are joining me with a guest over Zoom. And the guest I am very, very excited about is Dr. Barbara King. And the reason I'm so excited about her is multifold. First of all, she actually taught me when I was a little baby undergrad in college at William & Mary a long time ago. So I'm very, very excited to have her here. Today, Dr. King is actually a freelance science writer and public speaker. And I think that her career is really interesting because it kind of takes us on a journey from anthropology into activism, which I think is actually a pretty common route for a lot of anthropologists. So I'm very excited to welcome you onto the show today. Hello.
Hello. I'm so happy to be here. It's very nice to reconnect with you.
I know. I was really excited when you emailed me back. Listeners, just so you know, I didn't have Dr. King's personal email, so I sent a form email and she responded right away. She was you're so nice.
So are you. Thank you.
Thank you. So why don't we get started just talking a little bit about what your background in anthropology is, what you spent a lot of your career studying, which is primatology. It's something a lot of our listeners are very interested in.
Yeah, sure. More than a primatologist, I would define myself as a biological anthropologist from the beginning. So I went to graduate school with a very strong interest in getting to study monkeys and apes in their natural habitats. I was able to do that for my dissertation research by studying baboons in Amboseli, Kenya back in the 80s. And that only really galvanized more of my interest in looking at how our closest living relatives really just make their lives. How do they go about doing what they do? In particular, at that time, I was interested in questions of learning and intelligence in monkeys and apes. And we'll talk more about how that changed over the years. But what I think was so fun for me is realizing that as a biological anthropologist, I could look at monkeys in the field both as super interesting in their own right with their large, complex, dynamic groups and lots of social behavior happening, but also seeing them as one way to understand something about the roots of our human past. And I don't mean by this that monkeys are stand-ins for human ancestors, but rather that they may give us some sense of when the human lineage diverged in the past, what we were diverging from.
That is a very complete and coherent answer. So one of the themes that you really have pulled out here is the idea of just studying intelligence in general and understanding how intelligence and emotion and like social structures might relate to each other. I think a lot of people, when they think about those words, intelligence, social structures, emotions, they think about humans, but you were really focused on our primate cousins. And also you've kind of like taken that and applied it to other animals as well.
Yes, I was certainly very primate centric in the early years of my career. I had thought that I would spend the rest of my life really studying primates like monkeys and apes, but it didn't turn out that way. And just as you said, I wanted to really look for the range and extent and also limits of cognition and emotion in other primates. And over time, that morphed into looking for the scope and limits of cognition and emotion in many animals.
Was there a moment for you, like what kind of prompted this shift into looking not just at primates but animals as a whole?
Yes, you know, it's funny. When I was in grad school, the received wisdom, at least where I studied, was that chimpanzees, for example, are very much the top of the hierarchy in terms of expression of thinking and feeling in animals. So they're our closest living relatives. They're the most like us. They're clearly going to be just the best at everything, tool using and reasoning and expressing profound emotion. But I started reading the literature and reading more about cetaceans like dolphins and whales, reading about elephants. And of course, in Amboseli, doing my dissertation work too, I was surrounded by elephants. And I just began to think, you know, this is very limited. Why do we as humans assume that those animals closest to us in an evolutionary framework are necessarily the best at thinking and feeling? So I began to broaden out and just read and keep my eyes open, and everything started to shift.
I think that we should back up just a little bit and actually define some of the terms that we're using, because we're kind of like throwing around terms kind of willy-nilly, but like when we say intelligence or like sentience or emotion, those are three really big words, but what are we talking about?
Okay, so my term is animal cognition. I prefer that term, and I really am talking here about how animals acquire knowledge, how as they go about their daily lives, they're learning, acquiring knowledge, and then applying that knowledge to problem solving. And here, the problem, as I use that term, could be anything from how to find food using hands or tools, or something social. You know, how do I, as an infant, grow up in this group and make my way? Just a whole vast number of problems to solve that animals have every day. So related to that is the question of emotion, because we need to separate cognition and emotion when we talk about them as two terms, but they're very clearly intertwined in individuals' lives. So with emotion, I'm talking about how animals feel about what they experience. It's a very basic definition. So they find their role in a particular social group as, say, high ranking or low ranking, male, female, whatever. But then they surely process these experiences and have feelings about them. And that's the emotional aspect that I'm talking about. And lastly, the third term that you brought up is sentience. Here, I just ask people to think about the root of that word. sensation. Because when we talk about sentience, it's not the same thing as either cognition or emotion. We're talking about the ability for an animal to feel pain or pleasure. So this is a broader term as I see it. It is not necessarily limited to animals who are spending a lot of their lives learning, processing, and cognitively problem solving. It's simply asking, are they capable of feeling pain or pleasure? And that is, of course, applicable to a very wide range of animals.
Yes, certainly. I think that kind of the received wisdom that I had going into college was that we couldn't say whether or not animals felt emotion, which
that is still very much a pushback from certain areas of science. Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, no, it's definitely it's interesting because I feel like anyone who spent any significant amount of time with animals, any kind of animal, I think they would be very hard pressed to say that animals don't experience emotion. I mean, think about your dog or your cat, or for me, I grew up working on horse farms. Like, you can definitely, well, I definitely feel that in my experience, I see emotions in these animals, but it's something that certain areas of science, like you alluded to, just like do not accept.
Yeah, this is really changing. I stand by what I said, that there's pushback from some areas of science, and I still get what I call accusations of the A word, which is anthropomorphism. And the definition of anthropomorphism is that someone is projecting human qualities or capacities on some other animal. So if I were to say, oh, look, there's an elephant that very clearly is feeling grief, the response would be that I am just projecting what a human would feel in a particular situation with, say, a member of the social group having just died. And this is really at the heart of a lot of my work, because my response to this is making a couple of points. One, when we look for animal emotion, it's very much not a process of trying to figure out what's in an animal's mind. Instead, it's a process of looking at cues that the animal is giving off from his or her own life. So you're looking for visible expressions of some kind of clear emotion that one can see and assess and, of course, interpret, but something that is before you, that the animal is telling you from the ground up. And the second point about anthropomorphism is, if you think about what's really being said when someone says, oh, grief is a human experience and you're projecting it onto an elephant, that is making a claim that grief is unique to humans. And my response to that has been stronger and stronger over the years. We do not own grief. Grief is not a human capacity. Defining it as such is closing the question rather than opening it, which is, I think, what we need to do when we deal with the animal world.
Yes. And listeners, just in case you're wondering why we're talking about grief and elephants in particular, Dr. King wrote a book called How Animals Grieve that is wonderful, and a large part of it actually focuses on elephants.
Yes, there's a chapter about elephants. I focused in that book, which came out now 7 years ago, on also monkeys and apes, but in addition, cats and dogs and whales, and now I would include farm animals. But to try to keep to a clear structure here and to not wander too much in my thoughts, I am using grief as an example of animal emotion because it really fascinates me, and because I've spent now the last 8 years of my life in some ways really focusing on this. But the questions that you're getting at are broader. And I think that it is true that we can understand, as people who may live with animal companions, that there may be a broad range of emotions expressed. And the question really is, how do we know? And you can't make decisions about what an animal is capable of feeling based just on a couple of interactions, or in some cases, media reports or videos or photographs. One thing that I'm really emphasizing in my work is that there has to be a comparison of what an animal usually does in daily life, and then some expression of something perhaps new or novel or fresh that gives you a window into what they may be feeling. So, for example, if I might return again to grief, my definition for animal grief really requires that we look for a while, days more than hours, at how a surviving animal acts differently than he or she had in the past. Is there social withdrawal? Is there failure to eat or sleep? Is there a posture or vocalization of facial expression that's different? So this is highly comparative and rigorous work that depends on looking, observing very closely, and building a case up from what an animal is doing.
Yes, certainly. And I think that one of the things that I really appreciate about your writing is that you do a really good job of incorporating peer-reviewed papers and studies into your work in a way that's very, very accessible to someone who perhaps hasn't spent a lot of time like digging through statistics or very technical language. And one of the things that has really struck me is like kind of the ingenious ways that people have actually fashioned experiments to kind of try and test these ideas of animal cognition and emotion.
Yes, I think that's important. I think that there's a complementarity between experimental work and field work. I would like to think that we're moving away from experimental analysis of animal behavior more towards analysis of natural free-ranging animal behavior. But at the same time, there are some things we can learn if the animal is kept in some really humane, ethical situation in captivity. And there really aren't that many of those, so I'm a little bit hesitant about that. But with grief, of course, it's hard. You can't predict when you may have an animal become a survivor with a death in some terribly important relationship to them. The database is increasing, not only with grief, but with expressions of joy studied in wild animals, expressions of any number of emotions. So I'm very hopeful that that in particular will continue as we really begin to interrogate what type of captivity is or isn't acceptable for animals.
Yeah, and I think that this is kind of another thread that I see a lot of in your writing, and that for me is actually very grounded in your background in anthropology, which is that you really examine the human-animal interaction, and you really dig into cultural norms surrounding how humans view animals. I just finished reading your book, Personalities on the Plate. Just in case anyone is looking for a book, it was really excellent. Strong recommendation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. One of the things that I really liked about this book in particular is the way that you organized it. Listeners, the way that she did it, she had the first chapter started with insects and arachnids, and it kind of progressed through different forms of life with like kind of from more alien to more familiar. So we went from insects and arachnids to octopus to fish to chickens and then goats, cows, pigs, and finishing with chimpanzees. And the reason you chose all of these animals is these are all animals that are consumed around the world, but our interactions with them are all very, very different. And a lot of them are very culturally rooted. So for example, with insects, we have a strong aversion to eating insects in a lot of Western cultures, which just doesn't exist in other cultures at all. Like it's considered a delicacy in some cultures. That's like such a great example of how human culture kind of mediates our response to even just this like one particular interaction of like, is this food or is this not food?
Yeah, the anthropologist Julie Lesnick has some wonderful work on entomophagy, which is insect eating in human evolution. And through her work, we come to understand that it was very much a cultural norm as far as we can reconstruct past diet for many human populations, and still today for many human populations. And, you know, when I decided to go and try and eat some cricket tacos in Washington, D.C. in preparation for this book, it's very interesting to see, you know, how my friends reacted to that, because you're absolutely right. In most places in the West, it's really not considered a delicacy at all. And this is not necessarily a meal that I would repeat, not because it didn't taste good, it tasted fine, but because I'm moving more and more towards, you know, vegan eating. But to get back to the main point, I think in this culture, in the US and in the West, it's struck me how fascinated people are with just the things we're talking about, cognition and intelligence in chimpanzees and elephants and whales and dolphins, their dogs, their cats. But when it comes to farmed animals, people don't want to know. They're not as interested in the intelligence of chickens and goats and pigs and cows. And I began to ask myself why. And I guess the answer may be, in retrospect, pretty obvious. People don't want to know that what's on their plate, had a good or a bad day, or smartly solved a problem, or experienced grief or love. They don't want to know. And to me, that was really quite a shattering revelation.
I think that one of the things that I have noted in my own life is that we have moved increasingly away from living with the animals that become our food, and we've become completely disconnected. My brother was actually furious at me for this. I apparently revealed to my niece and nephew that the hamburger on their plate used to be a cow. And there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth. But I was like, how did your kids not know that this came from an animal? Like, where did they think that they came from? And the kids were like, it came from the grocery store. And I'm like, there's like a whole industrial system that exists. And of course I sound like the crazy, like crazy aunt who's just like, there's a whole system. But there's a whole system that exists that has to exist for them to get this prepackaged meat in this form. It's definitely something that we just don't really consider. And you're right that we do very much consider, we have a huge demarcation between animals that are friends and animals that are food, right? Like there's all these bills in the US that are trying to prevent horse slaughter, which in other countries, people eat horses just fine, no problem. But here they're considered a symbol of the American West and spirit and ingenuity and individualism. They're just a beloved friend who helped us conquer the West. Same thing with dogs. Mine's rooting around right now at my feet. Like we don't consider them food, but in other countries, that's definitely not a problem. And whole systems exist for those animals in other countries.
Well, you're so right to talk about systems, because the system of production of animals is brutal. And what goes along with that is a suppression of knowledge about animals. Kids don't know because there's a lot of people who don't want kids to know that what's on their plate come from animals that they've been, reading about in their storybooks at night and watching cute documentaries about, because it's really in the best interests of big agriculture and other systems that support family farms and factory farms to have that disconnect. So this is part of the fact that I felt like I myself was on a journey of discovery, because 10, 12 years ago, I was eating all of these animals without a second thought, without asking myself the hard questions. When I first showed up in Africa, I was actually in West Africa, in Gabon, because I was doing some captive work before I went to Kenya. And one of the very first restaurants I went to with friends in my first week, the waiter asked me if I'd like some monkey to eat for lunch. And of course, I didn't. And I thought to myself, I would never eat a monkey. I'm a biological anthropologist fascinated by these complex animals. The next question from the waiter was, would you like chicken instead? And I said, sure. Talk about a disconnect, because now that I've investigated chicken lives and pig lives and goat lives, I see all the things we're talking about: the sentience, the ability to feel pleasure and pain, the cognition in problem solving, the emotion in feeling things for others in the group, the herd, or whatever. So I've learned a lot doing this work. And part of that is learning about the systems that are in place to keep us thinking certain ways and how much work it takes to overcome those.
Yeah, certainly. I will say that one of the other things that really comes through in your writing is a degree of nuance that you sometimes don't see in other work that looks at that looks at the animal food system. One of the things that I really liked seeing in your work is that the acknowledgement that certain people, like, they rely on animals for food, and that's fine. Like, there's a small farmer in Africa somewhere who's probably raising pigs because it's one of the most eaten meats in the world. And like, it's not on us to like tell him, no, you cannot do that, right?
Yeah, I have learned a tremendous amount from my vegan colleagues. And at the same time, I sometimes do say and want to continue saying a rhetoric of every person in every population needs to go vegan is a non-anthropologically informed discourse for just the reasons that you've talked about. This is as true in the United States as it is in Africa and Asia, that we do not all have, obviously, the same resources financially or education-wise or ability to get the foods that we might choose to eat. And so I'm not really interested in becoming a lecturer in terms of suggesting what any individual people should be eating. At the same time, the other side of that coin is acknowledging what science tells us extremely clearly, that the way to reduce animal suffering and to work on issues of global warming and climate change is within the abilities each of us has to reduce consumption of meat and dairy. So it's hard sometimes to walk that line and to want to speak about both halves of that question with nuance and sensitivity. Sometimes I manage it better than others.
Yeah, I definitely, as I was reading it, it felt like a conversation that I had had with myself about being vegetarian or being vegan. And it's a conversation that I've had with myself multiple times over the years. And I think that's one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you, is I was like, it's like she can read my mind.
I just feel a strong urgency for people to pitch in. And part of the reason why I've been attending conferences, two so far at least, of the Reducitarian Foundation, is because I do believe that when people reduce consumption of meat and dairy, that is a truly positive contribution. And people should be welcomed and congratulated for doing that rather than being told they're not doing enough. I still make choices in my everyday life that are not perfect, that are not even good sometimes. And I know that whatever we eat, unfortunately, harms someone. This is just a fact. If you're vegan, and vegans know this, I'm not telling them, they've told me that there's still an amount of harm, whether you're eating, say, almond milk that causes some issues for ecology of insect populations, or you're talking about farming of vegetables that unintentionally kills small mammals or whatever. So the conversation needs to be broad, the conversation needs to be welcoming, needs to understand that we're not all in the same place. And that kind of approach I find much more welcoming.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's another theme that I've seen throughout your writing, is the idea of inclusion rather than exclusion. And it comes in many different levels, right? It comes in welcoming people who maybe are not vegan into the conversation, but then also the inclusion of the ideas of animal sentience or cognition, which had been kind of controversial for a long time.
Yes, I am working very hard on this notion that still exists of human exceptionalism. That we humans are still the most thoughtful, the smartest, the deepest feeling animals in the whole universe. And in some ways, and in some circumstances, that may be true. But first of all, it isn't true, I believe, in all circumstances. If we really understand the ocean cultures for, say, orcas, they're tremendously intelligent, social learning focused animals who also feel deeply. We could talk about primates. I'm fascinated with the octopus. I've been working quite a bit on both scholarship and activism when it comes to octopus. And by scholarship, I mean reading and understanding other people's work, but really working on this question of an invertebrate, a mollusk that is blowing away scientists and activists alike by challenging norms of human exceptionalism. Just 2 nights ago, I watched a movie called My Octopus Teacher, set in South Africa, that just lit up my whole week. Craig Foster went every day into the South African kelp forest to meet a particular octopus. And the film reveals so much. And if it doesn't challenge your human exceptionalism, I don't know what will. So this is a work in progress for all of us to learn how to think and push back against some of the things that we've perhaps been taught our whole lives.
Yeah, on the topic of octopuses, there is, and it is octopuses, listeners, because it comes from a Greek root, not a Latin one. There's this book by Cy Montgomery called The Soul of an Octopus, and it is incredible. And I really, really loved it. You actually mentioned it in your book too.
Yes, Cy Montgomery has written a number of incredibly wonderful books about the natural world. And I had the great pleasure of going to meet an octopus with Cy Montgomery 2 years ago. This was a giant Pacific octopus. In fact, there were two, a male and a female, in the New England Aquarium in Boston. It was quite an amazing experience. I wish in many ways that octopus were not kept in aquaria, but they are. And in this particular situation, meeting octopus behind the scenes was considered an enrichment for the octopus. And under those conditions, I was happy to participate. And it really changed my thinking. I was being tasted and explored by an arm of one of the octopus, and I knew that this arm was neuron rich, part of the brain of the animal, and that this wasn't just a random movement, but an animal exploring me with his brain. That was quite cool.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background for listeners who might not be as familiar with octopuses. So they have, their brain is kind of distributed throughout their bodies, and that's because they have these 8 crazy arms that are doing all of these different things. They have so much sensory information coming in through these arms that they have the scattered brains. But then also the what we perceive as like the little suction cups, those are also gathering a great deal of information in terms of like taste and even potentially smell and motion in the water. And that's kind of what Dr. King is talking about in terms of being like explored by a brain via this arm.
Yes, exactly. And what we know about octopus now in terms of their tool using and their problem solving and the fact that octopus have across their body these chromatophores, these color changing cells, means they flash red when they're excited or they go pale when they're not feeling well. It's another look into animal emotion.
I think the other thing that really stood out in my reading is kind of this idea that we have you talked about anthropomorphizing animals, but at the same time, we also have a very anthropocentric view of intelligence and cognition, when in reality, a lot of these animals are very, very clever in coming up with solutions that work for them in their environment. And so the idea is having a certain standard of cognition or intelligence based on humans doesn't make sense if you are an ocean-dwelling creature, right? Like they are adapted to challenges that we just are not.
Yes, it's certainly the idea of trying to really enter an animal's world and understand what their daily lives are like. In some cases, animals using tools would make no sense in a particular environment, but there may be, for example, echolocation abilities in some whales and, say, bats, that mean that they're highly attuned to the environment and solve problems in ways that we can't. So it's hard because our language constrains us. We have to use human-based language systems to talk about other animals. So in some cases, I think it makes a lot of sense to use human terms: society, language, intelligence, grief, and love, and then interrogate whether they really are or aren't human terms. But we're sometimes very limited by our language, and it's important to ask, what are these animals doing that we wouldn't even think of as being part of a framework of intelligence or sentience or emotion?
Yeah, there's that anthropology background again. How does language limit or shape our thought?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, at this point, I can't separate myself from an anthropological point of view because that's what I've been about for decades. So it's interesting to me that that you see that in ways that sometimes I'm so in it that I can't maybe pull out that that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that I really like about all anthropologists that I've read so far, all of their popular science books that I've read so far, is I feel like they're a lot more complete. Like they look at the science in a lot of different ways and in a way that's a lot more accessible. Like they're just constantly thinking about those things in a way that certain other people aren't really. So people who specialize in solely biology, like the way that they relate to the material is very different than someone who is used to thinking about those kind of human systems. And then on the other side of it, you have people who aren't scientists at all who are writing popular science books, and they can be good, but a lot of times they end up missing kind of that nuance of being able to do that scientific interpretation. I feel like there's kind of like this sweet spot. Here I am. I'm just out here advocating for anthropology.
I love that, of course. And I would also say at the same time that I'm reading a lot of what I guess you might call ethicists or people trained in science, whether that be in medicine, biology, psychology, who have taken a turn also in their careers towards activism. And they're not anthropologists, but they are bringing together a number of questions. And I'm thinking here of Hope Ferdowsian, who has written Phoenix Zones, or John Gluck, who has written Voracious Science and Vulnerable Animals. I learn a lot from this kind of discourse that brings questions from across the disciplines, and then I think of it as my job to put them through a sort of anthropological lens and to make them meaningful for me and perhaps meaningful for my readers, but because I've learned so much from those particular perspectives.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's also a really important thing that sometimes people don't think about is like this ability to take a lot of different ideas from a lot of different disciplines and bring them all together into something that's coherent. That's, I feel like, a rare skill and very impressive.
Yeah, you've mentioned about, popular science writing. And of course, that was another big transition for me. So in some ways, I think of my career as being about three transitions. We already talked about moving from primates only to a broader array of animals. That also kind of coincided with the idea that I wanted to work for animals as well as on animals. And then I wanted to write and speak to a diverse public instead of only pitching my work at academics. And that all sounds great, but then, you start to do it. The first time I actually tried to write a popular book, which is really a crossover book, that is a term that I prefer, which means that I'm trying to write both to academics and to the public at the same time. When I did that, and that was, maybe I would say 13, 14 years ago now, my editor took my pages of text that I had sweated over to make them publicly accessible and said, okay, well, this is not public writing. This is full of more technical terms than you even realize. And it took me a while to take on board his message. It's hard to shed a certain type of language use, a certain type of format that one just absorbs through the skin like an octopus in academia. And I really wanted to learn how to do that. And it took time to tell stories in such a way that really honor your audience's, strong intelligence, the intelligence they bring to your book, but also make accessible things that they might not have studied in their lives. And that's harder than it sounds, but it's become a real joy of my life to try to do that book by book, better and better.
Yeah, I think that you do a really excellent job. I think that one of the things that I noticed is that you do a really excellent job of balancing anecdotal or like personal stories with these actually like peer-reviewed studies in a way that makes the peer-reviewed studies, like, it gives you a window into why they went about doing it the way that they did. And you also, I don't know, I think even just talking to you right now, sometimes I'm like constantly stopping people and being like, oh, what's that though? Like, remember, like I might understand you, but like if you're, I don't know, a fourth grade teacher in Sheboygan, like they might not have heard of this before. So thank you.
Yeah, one of the real turning points of my last couple of years was being able to give a TED talk. And there's a funny TED talk out there, the premise of which is that lots of scientists and artists want to have given a TED talk, but actually to give the TED talk is a lot of work and very nerve-wracking. And that was true. But it an ability for me to reach new audiences that has been very exciting. I was invited to Vancouver, Canada in April 2019 to do this at the main annual TED conference. There's a main stage and you get your 14 minutes in my case to make your case. And what I talked about was grief and love in the animal kingdom. But that process too was akin in some ways to working with a book editor, because they don't just say, okay, get up and talk. You go through a process of vetting and constant practicing and having a panel of experts from TED listen to you and say, are you really communicating to a wide public in as vibrant, a set of terms as you can? Are you reaching people emotionally? So through all of these processes, whether it be book editors or, the TED panel, I think that I've learned that it's a storytelling craft. And I've learned to put more of myself in it than I had before in the ways that you've described, weaving myself, if you will, my experiences together with the peer-reviewed science. And I have a new book coming in March where I do that even more than I have before. And I really like the title that we've come up with, which is Animals' Best Friends, putting compassion to work for animals in captivity and in the wild. And I talk about how I've learned to do that and how I'm still on a journey of learning more to do that, so that I'm there with the reader as we talk about these difficult situations where we see animals in trouble in some way and we want to help.
Yeah. Very selfishly, since I'm an editor, everyone out there, listen to this very accomplished woman who listens to her editors.
I write now for a number of publications, newspapers, magazines, and my gosh, being improved by an editor is something that I rely on. I've written 2 articles this year for the anthropology online magazine, Sapiens. So I put in a plug for Sapiens. And that's just another example of, sending in a raw text, thinking it's pretty good, and it is pretty good, and then finding out that it gets improved.
Yeah, that's what I do. That's what I do all day. Talking about reading and also trying to be cognizant of your time, why don't we move on to the final portion of the interview? You have mentioned quite a few, I think actually between the two of us, we've mentioned quite a few books that people can read if they want to learn more. But if someone wants to learn more about your work, where's a good place for them to start? What's something that they could read?
In some ways, I think How Animals Grieve is considered to be, and I think this is accurate, a kind of foundational approach to my work. So How Animals Grieve, University of Chicago Press, 2013. I think that a look at my website can be helpful, which is www.barbarajking.com. And I'm highly active on Twitter, which is BJKingApe. I'm writing about what I'm doing, what the community of science writers is doing, and what all of us who care about animals is doing.
Excellent. Those are all really great resources. I can personally vouch for all of them. I've used all of them. And your TED Talk was really great too, if they're in more of a visual type person. Another thing that I liked about your books is that if you're reading one of Dr. King's books, I strongly recommend that you have your laptop open next to you, because you're constantly describing these YouTube videos where you can actually see some of the experiments or some of the behaviors that you're describing in the book. It's like almost a multimedia experience, which is pretty cool.
Oh, I love that. Thank you.
You're welcome. What are you reading for work right now?
Well, right now, this is the fall publishing season, just in high gear. And so I'm reading with my book reviewing hat on. I review a lot of books. I love writing them so much that I also love reviewing them. So I review for NPR, National Public Radio, Washington Post, Times Literary Supplement in London, and also for my first time, Science Magazine. I just finished reading Niamh Leakey's forthcoming memoir, The Sediments in Time. I am reading a book by Becky Sykes about Neanderthals called Kindred, and I have on the large stack anthropologist Paul Farmer's forthcoming book on the Ebola crisis in West Africa in 2014. So everything I'm reading right now, all those three are related to book reviewing.
What an interesting scope of work to be reviewing. I am definitely going to have to check some of those out. I guess once they come out for some of them.
Yes, they'll be out in October and November. Mm-hmm.
I'm very excited about that. And then final question, what are you consuming for fun right now?
Science fiction in multimedia ways. I have been reading just so much science fiction. I came across very belatedly the work of Jeff Vandermeer, and I ended up reviewing two of his books earlier this year. One is Dead Astronauts, and one is Born, B-O-R-N-E. And it just caused me to explode with excitement about the way that he writes. He's most well known for the novel Annihilation, which was made into a film. But just reading him and following him on Twitter and interacting with him on Twitter has been wonderful because he imagines different worlds and better worlds. And so I read science fiction for fun. And then at night, my husband and I are going through the whole Star Trek series. I mean, what we're doing is we're catching up on things that people saw years ago. We went through the whole Star Trek Next Generation, I think 7 seasons, and we're now finishing up DS9, 7 seasons. And again, it's this idea of thinking in different ways about humanity and kindness and compassion that I think is very uplifting.
I have actually also watched every single episode of Star Trek ever made. Me and my dad, we watched them all together. There was like a period in high school where we, instead of talking, we just watched a lot of sci-fi TV together. And I would say it was very good for our relationship.
Oh, I can see that. Absolutely. It's so much fun, and it gives us things to think about for days after any particular episode.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you making the time to come and talk to me as a fellow science communicator and also as someone that I admire greatly.
Oh, thank you. And I have to say that you are a very good interviewer because you're so well prepared, and that is not always the case. So I appreciate that.
I have to say that you are a very good interviewee. I can already tell that I will have to make very minimal edits to this show to get it out, which is always a relief to me since I also have like a full-time job that is not this podcast.
Yes.
Again, thank you so much for your time. And if you would ever like to come back, feel free to shoot me a message and I would love to have you back on.
Thank you. I will do that.
Excellent. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show was produced and edited by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.